There are moments in the music industry that stop everything. Moments where an artist who seemed untouchable, whose trajectory seemed written in the stars, suddenly finds themselves at the center of something that threatens to unravel everything they built. And then there are moments where new information surfaces. Evidence that reframes the entire narrative, that forces the public, the industry, and the culture to take a step back and reconsider everything they thought they knew. What is happening right now with D4vd is one of those moments. And if you have been following this story, you need to understand just how significantly recent developments have changed the conversation around one of the most gifted young artists of his generation. Before we get into this, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and smash the like button, because this is the kind of story you won't hear anywhere else. To understand the full weight of what is unfolding, you have to first understand who D4vd is and what he represents. David Burke, the Houston-born teenager who performs under the name D4vd, did not arrive in music through the traditional route. There was no record label grooming him from childhood, no industry connections, no carefully managed debut. He was a kid making music in his bedroom, recording on a free trial of a music production application, creating sounds that somehow managed to capture something deeply emotional and deeply modern at the same time. When his song Romantic Homicide surfaced on social media platforms in 2022, it did not grow slowly. It exploded. It accumulated hundreds of millions of streams seemingly overnight. It introduced the world to a voice and a sensibility that felt genuinely new, soft, melancholic, vulnerable, in a way that resonated powerfully with a generation of young listeners who had grown up navigating the emotional complexity of the digital age. He was 17 years old. He had never played a live show. He was still figuring out who he was as an artist and as a person. And suddenly the entire music industry was at his door. The deal he eventually signed, the team that assembled around him, the expectations that were placed on his shoulders, all of it came fast, perhaps too fast. Because the music industry has a long and well-documented history of taking young, extraordinarily talented artists and placing them in situations that serve the financial interests of the people around them far more than the interests of the artists themselves. The names are too numerous and too heartbreaking to list in full, but the pattern is familiar to anyone who has paid attention. Raw talent discovered young, signed quickly, subjected to commercial pressures that distort creative development, and ultimately left to navigate the fallout of decisions made before they were mature enough to fully understand what they were agreeing to. D4vd's story was, for a long time, presented as the exception to that pattern, the feel-good version of the bedroom pop discovery narrative. A kid who made it on his own terms, who maintained creative control, who was navigating fame with unusual grace and self-awareness for someone his age. And much of that narrative appeared to be true. His debut project showed genuine artistic range. His public presence was thoughtful and measured. He seemed, against the odds, to be handling it. But then things began to shift, quietly at first, and then with increasing speed. Details began to emerge that complicated the picture significantly. People close to the situation began talking. Documents that had previously been private began circulating in industry circles. And the story that had been told about D4vd's rise, carefully constructed and widely accepted, began to show cracks. The new evidence that has surfaced centers on several interconnected issues that touch the most fundamental questions any young artist faces. Who owns the music? Who controls the money? And who is making decisions about the direction of a career? These are not abstract legal questions. They are deeply personal ones. Because for an artist like D4vd, whose entire identity is bound up in the authenticity of his creative expression, any suggestion that the music he made, the music that came from his most private emotional experiences, was being managed, shaped, or exploited in ways he did not fully understand, or consent to strikes at something much deeper than contractual dispute. Sources familiar with the inner workings of his management and label situation have described a structure that placed significant control over his output and his earnings in the hands of people whose interests were not always aligned with his own. The speed at which he was signed, the complexity of the agreements he entered into at 17, the percentage structures that govern how his streaming revenue is distributed. These details, as they have become clearer, paint a picture that is considerably darker than the bedroom pop fairy tale the public was sold. There's also the question of creative interference. Multiple people who have worked with D4vd in studio settings have described a tension between the artist's instincts and the commercial pressures being applied by his team. The sound that made him famous, intimate, lo-fi, emotionally raw, is not necessarily the sound that maximizes playlist placement and radio airplay. The industry has a gravitational pull toward the mainstream, toward the polished and the predictable, and young artists without experienced and genuinely loyal advocates in their corner often find themselves making music that serves the algorithm rather than their own artistic vision. People who have been in the room during recording sessions have described D4vd pushing back against these pressures, fighting to maintain the creative authenticity that made him worth signing in the first place, but fighting that battle alone at 18 or 19 years old against a team of experienced industry professionals is an almost impossible position to be in. The financial picture has added another dimension to the story. The numbers that have surfaced regarding his streaming revenue and how it flows through the various entities involved in his career have raised serious questions. Romantic Homicide alone generated a staggering volume of streams, figures that should translate into meaningful financial security for a teenager from Houston, who not long ago was recording music on a free software trial. Whether that financial security has actually materialized for D4vd personally, or whether the majority of those earnings have been absorbed by the infrastructure built around him, is a question that new documents are forcing people to ask much more loudly than before. What makes this story particularly resonant is the generational dimension. D4vd is not just an individual artist. He is a representative of a new wave of musicians who built their audiences entirely through digital platforms, who bypassed the traditional gatekeepers of the industry, who seem to have found a path to creative and financial independence that previous generations never had access to. If the evidence now emerging shows that even these artists, the ones who arrive with their own audiences already built, who come to the table with leverage that bedroom pop kids of an earlier era could never have imagined, are still being placed into structures that exploit rather than protect them, that is a statement about the music industry that goes far beyond any individual case. The legal dimensions of the situation are still developing. Attorneys who specialize in music industry, contracts, and artist rights have begun examining the specifics of what D4vd signed and under what circumstances. The fact that he was a minor when many of these agreements were initiated creates significant legal complexity that works both for and against him, depending on the jurisdiction and the specific terms involved. Cases involving artists who were signed as minors have a complicated legal history. Some have resulted in meaningful contract renegotiations or nullifications. Others have dragged through courts for years while the artist's career momentum evaporates. D4vd himself has been characteristically measured in his public statements. He has not gone to war openly with his label or his management. He has not posted inflammatory content or made accusations that would expose him to legal counteraction. But the people who know him, who have watched him navigate this period, describe someone who is processing a significant and painful education about the realities of the industry he entered with such remarkable speed and at such a young age. The joy that defined his early public presence has been tempered by something more complicated. Something that looks, to those paying attention, like the specific disillusionment that comes from discovering that the people who said they believed in you were also, at the same time, building structures designed to profit from you. None of this erases what D4vd has created. The music is real. The emotional truth in it is real. The connection between his voice and the millions of people who found something in his songs that spoke to their own experiences. That is not diminished by anything happening in a boardroom or a legal filing. Great art survives the circumstances of its creation, but the full story of D4vd, where it goes from here, whether he emerges from this period with his creative autonomy and financial future intact, whether the new evidence changes his situation in ways that are legally and practically meaningful, is still being written. What we know right now is that the simple, beautiful narrative of the bedroom pop kid, who made it on his own terms, was never quite as simple as it appeared. And the evidence that has changed his life forever is forcing all of us to look more carefully at a music industry that keeps telling the same story about young artists, while the details behind the scenes keep telling a very different one. This is not just D4vd's story. It is the story of every gifted young artist who ever trusted the wrong people at the wrong moment, and it is far from over. If this video opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the scenes in the music industry, hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe if you haven't already. We cover the stories that go deeper than the headlines. I'll see you in the next one.